lips and speak with them. Take our minds and think with them. Take our hearts and set them on fire with love for you and all your people. Amen.
Amen.
Please be seated. In that region, there were shepherds living in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. Then an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. I'm struck this year. How many times have we heard this passage, right? Many of us have heard it a lot of times. I'm struck this year by, it was the shepherds God came to. The shepherds. I don't know if you know this, but they were the lowest of the low in the society. They were the outcasts. They were smelly. They lived in the fields. They didn't just abide their flock by night. They lived with their flock. And that's who God announces this message to. That's who God comes to. Not kings, not Pharisees, not the scribes, not the rich people, not the rich and powerful, but the shepherds, the lowly ones. God announces through an angel that a Savior, the Messiah, the Lord, is born in David's city, Bethlehem. And many commentators, and I've heard preachers also say, Bethlehem is a backwater. Bethlehem wasn't a place a lot of people went to. Why is this happening in Bethlehem, not in Jerusalem, the big city where the temple is? Doesn't it shock you? It shocks me. I mean, when you stop to think about it, I've listened to this story in a very different way this year. Because God was speaking to the lowest of the low. Not me, a nice, privileged, well-educated person. God was speaking to the outcasts, the people on the margins. And for me, it got even more amazing, this story, because the Word became incarnate. A baby was born out of wedlock. We just heard it in that passage. They were engaged, but they weren't yet married. The baby was born. And because of the crowds that were there for this census that was required, it was a busy place, Bethlehem. There wasn't room in the inn. Back in then, they called the inns weren't really inns like we think of them. It was more like a guest house. Somebody's house has an extra room and you let somebody stay when they come from out of town. But there were so many people. This baby wasn't born in a room, in a house, in an inn. This baby was born in the barn with the cattle, with the donkeys, with the chickens. This Messiah, this Savior, was born where the animals are kept in a backwater of Judea. Amazing what God is doing there. God appears on earth as a baby. God is incarnate. God takes our form as a baby, an unthreatening baby. No one can worry about a baby. How could a baby do any harm? But the angel announced it all to the shepherds and said, this amazing thing is happening. And the piece we're not getting in this gospel reading today, the next passage, the next paragraph, is that those shepherds went and told everybody, and everybody who heard this amazing thing was awestruck. They were amazed. They couldn't believe it. God is telling the people on the margins, the outcasts, about this amazing thing, about God coming to earth as a Savior, as the Messiah. And today's beautiful passage from Isaiah, I think it helps us understand this. The prophet Isaiah was speaking, of course, to a different group of people. Wasn't speaking to Christians. And we hear this passage with our Christian ears and hearts and minds. But the people who walk in darkness have seen a great light. As the passage from Luke said, glory shone upon them. God's glory shone upon them, and their yokes and their burdens were lifted, their oppressions. Now remember, in Isaiah's time, there was a lot of oppression. There were people who were in forced labor, people who weren't making any money for the work they were doing, and a few people who were making a lot of money at the hands of those who were doing all the work. And what Isaiah is saying with this birth of this child, this son, is that all that oppression is lifted. And God sends light. Luke tells us that glory shone round about them. God sends light with this angel to announce it to the low-class shepherds. It just amazes me. And Jesus, a Savior and Messiah, was born. It's all turned upside down. It's not what I grew up thinking about this holiday, thinking about this festival, this feast that we're remembering. I have it all romanticized from the hymns and stories that we've heard over the years. The hymns like we've sung this morning even. Christina Rossetti has some beautiful poetry about it. Love Came Down at Christmas is one of her poems. Do you know that perhaps? We sang it last night here.
That didn't sound very
good. Jesus is the light of God shining in our darkness. As Isaiah tells us, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. And John's gospel says it, the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can't comprehend it. The darkness can't overcome it. And just as Jesus was born and brought that light into the world, into the darkness, here's another amazing thing about this festival we remember. That light is in each one of us. It's not just that Jesus is that light, but each one of us has that light given to us by God. So Jesus' birth, this festival we remember, is God's big reminder for us of what John tells us in his gospel, his prologue, that that light is in us. And so here we are at this yearly festival of the birth of God's Son, and we're called forth, following in Jesus' footsteps and example, because we have that light inside each of us. By our actions, we are to give glory to God in the highest and bring peace and justice to all God's creation. Because that's who God favors. God favors all that God created. Everyone, everything. And I think that's why the angel appeared to the shepherds. And this baby who would grow to change the world was birthed next to cows and donkeys. God favors everyone. And God demonstrated that by this lowly birth. Poor and rich alike are favored by God. And that's what we remember, I hope. And I hope that's also what we are going to proclaim as we go forth. As I pondered this day and this sermon and these readings, I thought about the similarities also to our present day. And that our world looks a lot like that oppressive world of Isaiah's time and when Jesus was born. And it made me think, what can I do in this time? With that light of God, that light of love in my heart. And I was reminded of another Christina Rossetti poem which you may have sung last night. And the fourth verse of the hymn we sing, what can I give him, poor as I am? If I were a shepherd, I would bring a lamb. If I were a wise man, I would do my part. Yet, what can I give him? Give my heart. That's what we're called to do. We're called to go out in this difficult, troubled world and give our hearts. Because God gave us God's heart on that night when Jesus was born for us. Amen.
Amen.